what is metamodernism and why has it become so closely associated with the alt-right? Richard Spencer was quoted as saying that we memed the alt-right into existence. Now, what's interesting about the alt-right is not just that memes were used to promote the ideology of the alt-right, but also that they were used to form the ideology, in that the beliefs of the alt-right have been an organic process since its formation, and the development of the style and message of the memes associated with it have actually played a big role in shaping the central beliefs of the alt-right. Now, this has coincided with a big change in the kinds of memes that have become popular in the last few years. You know, we went from very simple 9gag type troll memes into some kind of post-ironic deep fried memes that people that aren't familiar with meme culture from the last 6 or 7 years wouldn't be able to understand whatsoever. There's even encyclopedias to try and explain all the context behind some of these memes. So what's interesting is that meme culture is now developing into a kind of metamodernism. And metamodernism itself is something that has been little studied and little talked about. In the view of academia, we're still in a postmodern world, and postmodernism is still the topic of focus. Writers like Foucault and Derrida and Baudrillard that are closely associated with postmodernism, there isn't the same kind of intellectual movement backing up metamodernism. But what's interesting is, coinciding with this development in aesthetics and memes, is a kind of intellectual dark web. Not the meek liberalism of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, but a real intellectual dark web of thinkers who are found on both the far left and the far right, who understand the importance of and advocate for an acceleration into metamodernism. So why is metamodernism so important to these kinds of thinkers who would be labelled extremists in the prevailing liberal paradigm? Well, the important thing to keep in mind is that metamodernism essentially defines itself as being in opposition to postmodernism. And what's interesting here is that the people creating metamodernism are mostly Generation Z through their use of post-ironic memes. David Foster Wallace, the author of Infinite Jest, really predicted a lot of this. He complained about the impossibility of escaping from irony in the modern world, and he was extremely concerned about what this overabundance of irony and cynicism would do to people in their individual lives and their lack of ability to express or understand real human emotions, and also to society as a whole, in that with this prevalence of cynicism, it was very hard for anyone to have a serious political discussion in which they seriously advocated for moral duties or for the common good, because any notion that was greater than the individual could just be taken down with the typical postmodern cynicism. And this was really the prevailing mood of Generation X. It's the sarcasm, the mistrust of authority, the mistrust of religious and political institutions. But in opposition to these, all Gen X could really present was a kind of rabid individualism, hedonism, sex, drugs, rock and roll. That was the ethos of Generation X. But for Generation Z, growing into this environment, their natural impulse to rebel against the established order is now actually an impulse that pushes them towards institutions, moral institutions and moral principles and moral values. Because what's there to rebel against now when the people in charge are the Gen Xers, are the boomers, are the people that rejected tradition and established social order and moral principles and replaced it with sweeping irony and cynicism and sarcasm. So for a generation raised watching The Simpsons and Family Guy, irony is really at the core of their communicative framework, and so any revolt against irony actually has to come from within the bounds of irony. So in other words, the only way to defeat the prevailing system of postmodern cynicism is by turning it in on itself. In other words, you have to use the logic of postmodern ironic cynicism to destroy postmodern ironic cynicism and allow for a rebuilding of some greater meta-narrative, the kind that was deemed to be impossible in a postmodern world. So that has really been the task of Generation Z, whether they realise it or not. And these memes have been a slow movement in consciousness, in developing the collective consciousness and political aims of this budding generation. And as they've developed, they've gone more and more from cynicism and irony into a kind of idealism. And so we find the way to destroy the postmodern framework, which is one that thrives and is built on cynicism, is through ironic idealism. And what's interesting is the election of Donald Trump was actually a big moment in this movement. Now, the success of Donald Trump has been much analysed and much talked about, but I think what's been ignored in a lot of these discussions is the fact that Trump was almost the first meta-modern political candidate. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, obviously Trump's campaign slogan was "Make America Great Again." Now, this mightn't seem like much, but there was a very meta-modern ethos to Trump's campaign. Firstly, he used the cynicism that's been prevailing over society for the last 30 years as a result of postmodernism. He used that to defeat the postmodern political system, which is one of decadent liberalism. And he did this by breaking all the social conventions which have been deemed arbitrary and worthless by the cynicism of postmodernism anyway. So he was able to get away with insulting his opponents. He was able to openly admit that he himself was somewhat of a moral degenerate and lived by eye for an eye and wasn't scared to get into a dirty race with political candidates. And that actually helped him because his honesty was seen as a refreshing counter to the prevailing hypocrisy of establishment politicians. And secondly, Trump's campaign was all about looking back towards the past, but there was also a lot of hope for the future. So there was this kind of blending of modernized America with a modernized thriving economy, but combined with the social values of an older America, of Reagan's America, of a post-World War II America that people have a certain nostalgia for, even people that don't actually remember it or weren't alive for it. So here we capture a central characteristic of meta-modern political movements, which is that they take the form of tradition and they combine that with the matter and technology of modernism. So you'll often see in the alt-right prevalence of a retro-futurist aesthetic. Now, the prevalence of this aesthetic can be explained due to the fact that this retro-futurism, which was popular in the 50s, which was another time of great optimism looking towards the future, when people were actually daring to imagine what a future utopia would look like, but they were still married to traditional concepts of society and family and marriage. So you'll see 50s retrofuturism, where it's a nuclear family living on a colony on the moon. So suddenly this takes on a new appeal for the newer metamodern generation, due to the fact that it appeals not just to the tendency to look forward to a kind of utopia and to an increase in modernism which seems inevitable, but it also takes the form of a more traditional time. And so when people are reacting against liberalism, which pushes a grey, globalized, individualist ethos, which makes it seem inevitable that the future would be one of sprawling multicultural cities, liberalism, and not looking to the stairs and not looking to a greater social project, then to have an art form that actually presents an alternative view which is outside that paradigm, which is one of the traditional society, the traditional Americana, traditional nationalism, patriotism, family, religion, social order, to take that and transfer it to an optimistic vision of the future, which could be one of colonizing Mars, or building a Euro-Siberian empire. Well, that's quite refreshing, and that's another form of ironic idealism. Only ironic in the fact that it is so counter to anything that we could currently imagine within this political paradigm. It's a complete rejection and reaction against it. And so Trump was kind of a forerunner to this, in that he had a kind of not retro-futurist outlook, but he did want to take the values and the norms of an older time and transfer it to this time, while also going on with economic modernization and making America one of the strongest economies in the world. So we see here that metamodernism, while it's not explicitly right or left wing, it is associated with a more collective view of the world. And this is why Trump was able to get away with going outside the traditional Republican positions of, being against universalized healthcare and being for foreign wars for Israel. Trump was able to inject some real nationalism into his campaign, because metamodernism, it both allows the rejection of postmodernism through ironic idealism, but it also paves the way for a rebuilding of a new ethos, which, in opposition to postmodernism, which was rabidly individualist, allows for collectivist ideologies, which had been out of fashion due mostly to the cynicism of postmodernism, which made any meta-narrative seem outdated and set it up for ridicule through ironic cynicism, which was the language of postmodernism. So metamodernism allows an inversion of postmodernism and allows us to return to collective ways of thinking, to looking to societal goods, to greater aims than the individual, and ultimately to rebuilding projects of utopia, which had been deemed to account for much of the evil of modernism in the postmodern view of things. The sketching of utopias was seen as a modernist project that dehumanized the individual and justified mass slaughter of the kind seen in the Holocaust and many other genocides in the 20th century. But metamodernism ultimately is more in line with these greater social projects, because it's brought about by a generation who has experienced what the postmodern alternative was to this collectivized modernism, and they realize that the individualized, atomized way of life of postmodern liberalism is probably just as bad or worse as the numerous incidents of political slaughter in the 20th century. And metamodernists will say that while yes, some of these are terrible, ultimately we have discovered now that a collective and a mythos and a greater aim of society and a noble lie, as Plato would say, a belief structure that can underlie each individual of society and uphold moral values and principles, that now is needed, and the postmodern political experiment has basically failed. And so at the same time we see a rejuvenation of interest in the works of authors like René Guénon, Julius Evola, Fritjof Schuon, all these traditionalist authors who sought a return to traditionalist way of life, more so traditionalist way of thinking. They wanted a rejection of the modern world, a rejection of its equality principle in politics, a rejection of empiricism in epistemology, a rejection of the dominance of science over other forms of knowledge, especially mysticism and more esoteric forms of knowledge which dominated in more ancient societies. So those authors have become popular as maybe being people that could provide the blueprint for what, ironically, this new society could look like based on traditionalist principles. So there again you see metamodernism, the natural urge is to take the developments of modernism and a futurist, maybe optimistic outlook, and to try and combine them with a more traditionalist ethos. Basically they want a good foundation to build the house on, so the house being economic modernization, all the technological advancements that are surely coming in the next century, the potential maybe to expand life to other planets. But they want that not to be in the interest of just, speculation, profit, individual gain, hedonism, more comfort for the worldwide population, or these liberal goals like reduction in poverty and kind of wishy-washy things like universal education and individualizing women and tearing down traditional religious structures. Metamodernists for the most part aren't interested in that. They want this brave new world, so to speak, to be underlined by a foundation that can be more lasting and that can provide more social order, which would be a more traditionalist ethos. So some kind of moral absolute from which a greater worldview can be built. And that's why we see within the alt-right there's much of a desire of a return to Christianity, and for the most part this is often Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, or orthodoxy rather than Protestantism. And this is for the same reason spoken of. They want a more traditionalist ethos, one compatible with a traditionalist view of the world as outlined by Julius Evola, which would be an anti-egalitarian social movement which prizes the collective over the individual. And that's why the main division now in the alt-right is not between libertarians and statists or whatever other divisions there has been. One of the main divisions now would be between pagans and Christians, for who thinks what religious structure could best carry the European peoples forward in being a foundation for that structure of development. So ultimately, metamodernism allows a return to ways of looking at the world and ideologies that we imagined were confined to the dustbin of history, it shows that despite all the growth in cynicism and everyone's exposure to irony and to an individualist rejection of traditional norms, that these aren't dead yet, and ultimately they will always come back. And even if postmodernism was able to inject a general cynicism across the entire population through media and culture, that ultimately people can only live for so long without meaning in their lives, and eventually they will come together, as we're seeing in metamodernism, and create this kind of what might be called collective existentialism. And that's obviously why in the alt-right you see a case of the metamodernism being closely associated with the rebirth of interest in fascism. So why would fascism so closely be associated with metamodern aesthetics? So much so that it's created its own brand of aesthetics called Fash Wave. Well, in a lot of ways, fascism is the ultimate metamodern political ideology. Firstly, because fascism has become so toxic and so looked down on by the liberal order, it's the ultimate boogeyman, that it's almost the ultimate ironic rejection of the established order to just outright declare yourself a fascist. It's a complete rejection of the limitations of cynicism which were imposed by postmodernism. It's a complete rejection of individualism. It's a complete rejection of the subjectivist worldview, and an outright return to a collectivist objective worldview. And so fascism is, in a way, allows not just the complete tearing down of these dominant social norms, but it also allows, as metamodernism does rather, the building of utopia. And it allows a return to a kind of thinking that even if it's outside the bounds of a traditional religious structure, it allows for people that were brought up outside of those structures to come together collectively and try and build a utopia. And while many would see that as a fascist project, that is ultimately the central project of metamodernism. Now, whether that project goes in a left-wing direction, which would be globalized, maybe alt-left, a new kind of Marxism, or whether it goes in the direction of the alt-right or the meta-right, which is a growing movement within the alt-right, we'll have to wait and see. But ultimately, the growth into metamodernism and the destruction of postmodern ways of seeing the world will mean that the dominance, the end of history that Fukuyama spoke of which is the dominance of the liberal paradigm, is going to end, and we will have a return to objective ways of viewing the world. And in the end, one of them is going to win out. But ultimately, the atomized liberalism, the rampant individualism, the consumerism, all of this that's associated with liberalism, which is essentially the social superstructure of the base of capitalism, which is now in late stage capitalism, just as postmodernism is kind of in late stage postmodernism, which is post-postmodernism, which ultimately will be collapsed in on itself through ironic idealism and turn into metamodernism. So too will the social structures which were created by postmodernism be turned into new structures, and there will be new collectivist ways of living which will destroy the prevailing institutions. So it's impossible to know how long this will take, but the growth and the birth of Metamodernism is a sure sign that this change is coming, just as 60, 70 years ago the growth in postmodernism was a sure sign that the end of the modernist project was coming.